So why don't we talk about and finish up with James 2:24, the classic Protestant Catholic, jousting, so to speak. Catholics, so because they'll say, faith alone, it's by faith alone. And Catholics will say, no, it's not by faith alone. That's what James says. And they'll, of course, go to Ephesians 2:8-9 and, Romans 3 and other passages. But Protestants attempt to give several responses to debunk or minimize James 2:24, which says that we are saved by works, or I believe it says that we are justified by works and not by faith alone. And so what would one of these responses be? And, how could a Catholic, respond to that? Or, what would they say in response to it?
Yeah. So there's really one major common comeback that's given. R.C. Sproul articulates it well. He writes, our works justify our claim to faith in the eyes of human beholders. Such justification or vindication is not necessary for God. So the idea is, hey, listen, you Catholics, when you appeal to this passage, you're assuming that the justification that James is referring to is a justification in relation to God. But actually what he's referring to is a justification in relation to men. And the passage they often appeal to is James 2:18. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I by my works will show you my faith. So rather than it being a justification in relation to God, it's a justification or salvation or being justified as perceived by men. Like men are able to know that I am in a right relationship with God or I am saved. So that's the common comeback. So how do we respond? Well, first of all, Bryan, this comeback fails to consider the salvific context of the passage. So, for example, if you look at James 2:14, what does it profit, my brethren, if a man says he has faith but has not works? Can his faith save him? So the question becomes, well, what kind of salvation is James talking about? Is he talking about temporal salvation, which is the dominant sense of salvation throughout the Old Testament? Or is he talking about salvation in the sense of being saved by God in relation to God? Well, I argue the latter. The context supports the latter interpretation, that we're talking about the actual gift of salvation that God grants us. So notice what James says, for faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. He doesn't say faith is dead in the sight of men. He simply says faith itself is dead. Now, if James meant that our works justify us merely in the sight of men, then our lack of works would have no negative effect on faith itself. It would only have effect on faith as seen by men. But that's not what James says. James says faith itself is going to be dead if we do not have the works of charity that he articulates, clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, works of love. Also, there's 3 other times when the Greek word sozo is used in James' epistle. Each of those times, he uses it in reference to the salvation that God grants our souls. And that's in James 1:21, 4:12, and 5:20. And then finally, check this out, Bryan. The two acts of charity that James lists as being necessary for faith to save us are of the same family of works that Jesus articulates that are necessary for us to inherit the kingdom of heaven prepared for us, according to Matthew chapter 25, verses 35-36. So the context of James 2:24 is a salvific context, and in particular, the salvation that God grants our souls. Now, perhaps even more convincing is that this interpretation, namely that the justification James is speaking of is in the sight of men, not in the sight of God, it doesn't jibe with the parallel that James draws between our justification by works and Abraham's faith in offering Isaac. Because James clearly appeals to Abraham and his offering of Isaac and the justification that he had as a result of that obedient act in verses 21-23. He uses that as an example for our Christian justification by works and not by faith alone. The obedient action of Abraham in Genesis chapter 22, the justification that James sees Abraham as receiving as a result of that obedience is the same justification that Abraham receives from God in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, when we're told Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. James even quotes that text in relation to Abraham offering up his son Isaac in sacrifice. So the justification that Abraham is said to have as a result of his obedient act of offering up his son Isaac is the justification that even our Protestant friends recognize to be justification in the sight of God in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. And James is saying it's that justification of Abraham that it parallels the Christian justification by works. And so the idea that the justification in the sight of man and not God does not jibe with Abraham's justification in the sight of God that James uses as an example for Christian justification by works. And then if you think about it, Bryan, when Abraham offered up his son Isaac on Mount Moriah, there was no one there for his justification to be in the sight of. The justification was in the sight of God, not man. So to our justification that James talks about in James 2:24, justification by works, not by faith alone, is justification in the sight of God, not in the sight of man. And there are many more lines of argumentation in response to this comeback that I point out in the book.
Yeah, all great points. It reminds me of Sunday's reading from this past weekend. It says, by faith, Abraham obeyed God when he was called to go out to the place. He went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land. Everything by faith and obedience are always brought together. Faith and obedience, even faith and disobedience, John contrasts as well. So when we're talking about true faith, it's always an obedient faith that loves Christ and follows his commandments and does works of charity as well. Oh my gosh, I'm so passionate about this. You're so passionate about this. I could go on all day, but unfortunately we have to end the show. It's a wonderful show. And I'm so thankful that you've come on here today. Can you tell people where they can find you, where they can find your books? And just so people know, I'm going to link it all down below as well.
Yeah, thanks, Bryan. So they can get the book at shop.catholic.com. That's Catholic Answers online store. Of course, Amazon has it and other Catholic bookstores. And they can follow my work at Catholic.com. So all of the videos and the radio shows and the articles that I write are all found there. I also have my own website, KarloBroussard.com. And that just serves as a one-stop shop for the stuff that I do here at Catholic Answers, because we produce so much content in a day. Often what goes out in the morning will get lost in the feed by the end of the day. But Catholic.com is where your viewers and listeners can follow my work.
And I loved your passionate, on fire presentation. And I don't know if people are on the same page we are, but this is why I love apologetics. It's just so, it makes me on fire, makes me passionate. I just want to know as much as humanly possible, just because it makes sense. And when it makes sense, it's like a puzzle and all the pieces go in place. And when you see the whole picture, you're like, I get it. It makes sense. It's wonderful. Yeah. And that's what I want to challenge our listeners and your listeners to do, is to really study your faith, really know your faith, explore your faith, buy these books and learn them, underline them, circle them, really learn the arguments, so that when you do evangelize people, you don't have to get angry. You don't have to yell. You don't have to scream. You don't have to condemn. You don't have to be sassy. You could just present arguments because you're not fearful of the attacks that are coming your way.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up, Bryan, because I point this out in either the introduction or the conclusion of the book. And that's one of the goods of the book. And one of the reasons why I wrote the book, in order to articulate these Protestant comebacks in a way that can elicit from us as Catholics a greater respect for our Protestant friends, right? So that we can love them in a charitable way in our conversations and have a charitable, fruitful dialogue with them. We can appreciate where they're coming from.
Amen. So thank you for that. Thank you for your book, and thank you for coming on our show today. And I want to thank everyone here for watching our podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Please check out our show description notes below. You can check out our books, his books, our PayPal, Patreon, social media. And please keep praying for us, because we're always praying for you. Thanks for tuning in, and God bless you.